Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from one of the expert witnesses instructed by the inquiry. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the panel, good morning. Before I call Mr. Jonathan Sakula, an expert witness to this inquiry, I wanted to briefly explain the background to his involvement in the inquiry. As all core participants will already be aware, the inquiry has been looking for some time to appoint an expert with knowledge of the cladding industry to assist the inquiry with its investigations. On the 26th of October 2020, Jonathan Sakula, an expert with over 30 years' experience in the facade industry, was appointed as an expert to the inquiry. On the 3rd of November 2020, he received a written set of instructions identifying a number of key questions, the answers to which were of particular interest to the inquiry. By these questions, the inquiry sought to gain a greater understanding and insight into the cladding industry in the period January 2012 to June 2017, and particularly about its state of knowledge during that time, including as to the fire risks posed by aluminium composite panels, ACM panels, with a PE polyethylene core. Mr. Sakula produced a written report in response to those questions on the 13th of March 2021, and hence his oral evidence is being heard at this stage in the inquiry's timetable. This also gives core participants the chance to hear his oral evidence in good time before the oral closing submissions in modules 1 to 3. For the avoidance of doubt, his evidence is primarily relevant to the issues which we explored in Module 1 of the inquiry's work and sits with that evidence rather than being relevant to the Module 3 evidence, which you have been hearing in recent days. So with that brief introduction, I would now like to call Mr. Jonathan Sakula to give his expert evidence.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning.
I understand that you are willing to make the affirmation.
Yes.
And the words are there on the screen, so if you'd read them out, please.
Thank you. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now do sit down and make yourself comfortable. And before Miss Grange begins examining you, I'm going to ask you to help us with one important but small point. How should we pronounce your surname?
Sakula.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes. Thank you very much for coming to give your oral evidence as an expert to the inquiry. We are very grateful to you for all your assistance. Can I ask you to keep your voice up while you're giving your oral evidence so that the transcriber who's just sitting to your right can get a clear record down of the evidence that you give? It also helps if you say yes or no in response to my questions rather than shaking or nodding your head so that there's a record on the transcript. And we will take a break at a convenient moment mid-morning and then again this afternoon. Now, by way of a letter of instruction dated the 3rd of November 2020, you were instructed by this inquiry to answer a series of discrete questions. And those questions are helpfully set out at Appendix A of your report. If we could turn that up, that's JOS 701 at page 72. So here we can see the annex to the instructions you were sent, which sets out the questions that you were posed. And I'm just going to read out the first two paragraphs of that. The inquiry wishes to understand more about the cladding industry in the period January 2012 to June 2017. In asking you about the state of knowledge within the cladding industry during that period, we would like to understand what a specialist cladding contractor exercising reasonable skill and care would have appreciated and understood about certain matters as set out in the questions below. Except where indicated otherwise, we would ask you to examine the position, one, in England and Wales and in the rest of the UK, if possible. In providing an opinion on these matters, we are particularly interested to know whether you can point to any industry conferences, journals and other publications, circulars or guidance available during the relevant period, which provide objective evidence of the information that was available about these matters within the industry. To the extent that the position changed between 2012 and June 2017, please describe those changes when answering the questions and explain why they occurred. Please also explain any differences of opinion, understanding and practice within the industry during that period. And then we can see that below that you were asked a series of questions about the state of knowledge within the cladding industry of various matters, including in particular regarding the fire risks posed by the use of ACM panels, including with a polyethylene core. Now, I'm not going to read out all those questions at this stage. We will revisit many of those during your evidence today. Now, in response to those questions, you have produced a written report. If we go to the front page of that, so that's, yes, there we have it. So this is the front page of your report of the facade expert, and we can see there that it's dated the 13th of March 2021. And if we could go within the report to page 71, we can see the same date, the 13th of March 2021. We can go on to page 71. Yes. And is that your signature there?
Yes.
And to confirm, you've structured your report by chapter, each of which deals with the questions you were asked in turn. Is that correct?
Yes.
And are the factual matters set out in your report true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And does your report accurately set out your true and professional opinions on the matters you were asked to consider?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Now, I want to ask you some questions first about your background and experience. Now, in Section 3 and Appendix B of your report, you've outlined your background and experience relevant to matters to this inquiry. If we can turn to Section 3 at page 18 of this report, there you've set out in detail your background. I'm not going to go through the detail of all of that, but I'm going to highlight some key points, which if you can just confirm. So is it right that you've worked in the construction industry for over 45 years and in the facade industry in particular for almost 30 years?
Yes.
And you have a degree in engineering from the University of Cambridge, and you are a chartered engineer, a fellow of the Institution of Structural Engineers, and a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Is that correct?
Yes.
And after studying engineering at university, you started your career as a structural engineer with Arup, and after a number of years working in the construction industry here and abroad, you became a founder member of our Arup Facade Engineering in 1992. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you then worked as a facade team leader for companies including Dewhurst, McFarlane and Yollis and Halcrow, before spending the last 7 years of your full-time career as the technical director for Bureau Happold Facade Engineering in London.
Yes.
Can you just help us and just explain the difference? You've been a facade team leader for major construction companies, and you've also been a technical director for Bureau Happold. Can you just explain the difference between those roles?
Yes. The facade team leader would have had overall responsibility for leading a team, which would go beyond the purely technical. It would involve dealing with people and management issues and financial matters and so on. The technical director's responsibility was essentially more technically focused.
Yes, thank you. And while at Bureau Happold, you were also responsible for technical coordination with Bureau Happold's USA, Middle Eastern and East African facade teams. Is that correct?
East Asian.
Sorry, East Asian.
Yes,
sorry.
That's correct.
And then before retiring in 2017, you worked as a principal for Bureau Happold's New York office, leading their facade team. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain what the role of a principal was within Bureau Happold when you were in New York?
It was a title of seniority, effectively. It was probably one below being a partner.
Right, yes, thank you. And what were your responsibilities as principal for Bureau Happold's New York office?
Leading the team. As I said before, it was essentially dealing with the staffing, the management, the financial, and in this case also some of the technical issues involved.
Yeah, so you would still have technical issues referred to you in that role?
Yes.
Yes.
Although we did have a technical director as well.
Right, yes. And is it right that since retiring, you've worked as a facade expert and consultant?
Yes.
Yes. Now, you say at paragraph 3.5, if we just look at that on page 18 of your report, so it's the page we're on, you tell us, during the course of my career, I've worked on many projects, ranging from structural engineering for whole buildings and parts of buildings, to facade engineering and also research and development work. For the facade consultancy project since 1992, I have worked at all stages of the construction process for building owners, architects, main contractors and facade subcontractors. I have worked in the office as a designer, specifier, and also on site inspecting new work and carrying out investigations where there were facade-related problems on existing buildings. Now, in terms of the sentence in the middle of that paragraph, you say, for the facade consultancy project since 1992, I've worked at all stages of the construction process. Just to be clear, in terms of that last sentence, do you mean that when working on facade projects and since 1992, you've worked at all different stages of the construction process?
Yes, I'm making that point only because prior to 1992, I was working essentially as a structural engineer, whereas I started working as a facade engineer after 1992.
Yes, thank you. Have you ever worked alongside or in the role of a cladding contractor as distinct from in the role of a cladding or facade consultant?
I've never worked as a cladding contractor, but I have worked for cladding contractors.
Yes. And what's the extent of your experience working for cladding contractors?
Essentially, it was working as an engineer, helping them with the detailed design of some of the more technical parts of the project, typically of a structural nature, sometimes of a thermal nature.
Yes, thank you. And at paragraph 3.3, slightly earlier on that page, higher up, you tell us 4 lines down that one of the projects that you led was the overcladding of a tall residential tower block in Hackney, East London. Now, can you help us just approximately when was that project? When did that take place?
Approximately 1993.
Yes. And can you help us, was that tower block over 18 metres?
Yes.
Yes.
It was 20 stories.
And was that a refurbishment or a new build project?
It was a refurbishment.
Yes. And can you recall what overcladding materials were used?
Yes, it were aluminium panels.
What type of aluminium panels? Were they aluminium composite panels or pure aluminium panels?
Pure aluminium panels.
Yes. And did the project involve the installation of insulation and cavity barriers behind the panels?
Yes.
Can you remember what type of insulation was installed?
I'm pretty sure it was mineral wool.
Right, yes. And what was your particular role in relation to that overcladding project?
I was effectively leading our small team as the facade consultant to the Borough of Hackney.
Right, yeah. So you were employed by the London Borough of Hackney to act as a facade consultant?
Yes.
And so what was your involvement in terms of the design of that overcladding?
There was an architect involved, and our role as facade engineer was simply to deal with the technical side of the cladding and write a specification and typical drawings showing the principles of the cladding.
Great. And then the architect subsumed that work into its own work and took that
Yes.
forward?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, you've set out some further selected project experience in your CV. If we could look at that, that's on page 77 of your report in one of the annexes. And we can see, yes, there at the bottom of that page, you've listed a number of projects under the heading Selected Project Experience. The final entry on that page we can see is the Stratford Eye Tower, London E15. And you say that was a review of facade matters for main contractor for a 20-storey residential tower. Again, can you help us roughly when was that project? When did that take place?
That would have been about 2002, 2003.
And it sounds like that was a building over 18 metres if it had 20 stories, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And again, can you help us? Was that a refurb project or a new build?
That was a new build.
Yeah. And what did your review of facade matters entail?
Well, in that case, I was working for the main contractor as the client, my client, and was effectively helping the contractor deal with technical submissions from their own specialist subcontractor. So it would have been reviewing drawings, reviewing the technical submissions, and so on.
Yes, I see. Yes, so acting as a kind of checking mechanism for the main contractor.
Yes.
In terms of the subcontractor's facade design.
Yes.
Yes. And did that review of facade matters, would that have extended as necessary to checking compliance matters, compliance with building regulations and associated guidance?
No, I don't recall it involving that, no.
Right, yeah. Do you have any other experience of rain screen overcladding projects on buildings over 18 metres?
Not of overcladding projects, no.
Right, yeah. Now, I want to ask you some questions now, more general questions about the UK cladding industry.
Yeah.
And if we look at section 5 of your report on page 21, we can see that you provide some information about the nature of the UK cladding industry. And I want to pick it up at paragraph 5.1.3. And you say there that it may be helpful to explain briefly the nature and evolution of the UK cladding industry over the last 50 years. And then you go on at 5.1.4, you say, during the 1970s and 1980s, there was an increase in the penetration of the UK and UK-related overseas facade markets by facade contractors from countries in mainland Europe, for example, from Italy, Germany, Switzerland, France, and Holland. And you say design and technical staff from those countries had a relatively high level of technical education. Now, just pausing there, can you help us as to what it was that led to the increase in the penetration of the UK facade markets by these mainland European countries? Were there particular factors, circumstances which led to that penetration of the market?
It's interesting. The impression I have is that they were technically stronger. But of course, this was before the time when I started my own work as a facade consultant. So I'm looking back.
Yes.
Prior to that. But the impression I got is that they were technically stronger, and they started to dominate the market in the UK for projects which required that higher level of technical excellence.
Yes. And when you tell us in that second sentence that I read that the design and technical staff from these countries had a relatively high level of technical education, what level of education are you referring to there?
Well, the sort of the tradition in Europe, countries like Germany, say, they had the tradition of technical high schools with a pretty good level of technical engineering type of education, probably better than Britain at that time.
Yes.
And that's what I'm referring to.
Yes.
And I think, without going too much off on a tangent, I think it's interesting that the technical world and the engineering world in mainland Europe was probably more developed or developing at that time than it was in Britain.
Yes, yes. And are there any particular speciality or specialities that you noticed that in, where they were technically more advanced?
Not specifically. I would also note that what was also interesting is that in countries like Italy, there was a tendency to have a more joint engineering architectural degree, not so much compartmentalized into engineering and architecture. So engineers and other technical people in the construction industry coming out of Italy, for example, would have had a stronger architectural sensibility, possibly, than those equivalents in the UK.
Yes.
So that was probably a difference.
Yes, yes. And was this a level of education and of technical speciality that UK cladding contractors did not possess at that time? Was that your perception?
Well, as I say, I'm looking back here at the 1970s and 80s before I actually became involved. So and it's only based on my understanding of what took place at that time.
Yes.
But yes, your question was?
Was it a level of education and technical speciality or expertise that these mainland Europe countries had that UK cladding contractors did not possess?
I wouldn't say that the UK cladding contractors did not possess. It was just a question of relatively. The mainland European ones were slightly stronger.
Yeah, thank you. And you go on to say, just looking at the last third of that paragraph 5.1.4, you say, in more recent years, since 2000, the UK and international marketplace has also included facade contractors from China. Tender lists for large or complex buildings would therefore have comprised mainly such companies. Now, just to clarify, where you refer there to mainly such companies here, and you're referring to international cladding contractors, is that from both Europe and latterly China?
Yes.
Yes. So you're saying that tender lists for large or complex buildings would therefore have comprised mainly companies from mainland Europe and latterly China?
Yes.
Now, can you help us? You've used the expression there, tender lists for large or complex buildings. Can you help us as to what your definition is there of a large or complex building in the context you're referring to in that paragraph?
Well, for example, I'm not including in that category low-rise, small buildings. A complex building is something which involves technical challenges going beyond the everyday, the routine. A large building is something. You mean how large is large?
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's helpful.
Large is. I wouldn't like to put a number on it, but I would include, for example, Grenfell Tower in the category large, although not complex.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. You say in the paragraph below, 5.1.5, you say, by contrast, the UK facade contractors would have carried out the more routine facade work. In particular, overcladding work of the kind used for Grenfell Tower would normally have had mainly UK companies on the tender lists. So in terms of that paragraph, what type of work are you referring to there when you refer to UK cladding contractors would have carried out the more routine facade work?
Well, as I've said, overcladding work of the kind used for Grenfell Tower, but I mean also facade work in general for relatively low-rise buildings, maybe 10 stories or so, and and which didn't involve any particularly complex challenges.
Yes. Yeah. And can you explain to us why the kind of work done at Grenfell Tower was in that category of the more routine facade work? Can you just help us with that?
Yes, I mean, from a technical point of view, it wasn't particularly unusual what they were doing on the outside of the building. They were putting up rails and putting up panels and insulation inside and so on. And that's been done quite a lot in Britain. So that's why I call it relatively routine.
Yes. Yeah. And can you also help us understand why that work was ordinarily carried out by the UK facade contractors?
Well, I would imagine it's because companies from outside Britain wouldn't have bothered to bid for relatively routine projects.
Yes.
Because they just wouldn't have been that interested in those. They would have bid for the ones where there was more of a challenge and possibly more from a commercial point of view, there was more value in them for the overseas companies. They would have been more interested.
Yes.
I would say probably from a commercial point of view, the profit margins on these kinds of projects in Britain would have been less attractive for an overseas company.
Yes, yes. And you go on to say, if we look a little bit down that page at 5.1.6, that you tell us, in considering the state of knowledge within the cladding industry, therefore, I shall consider only the typical UK-based contractors and not the international players referred to above. Mm-hmm. Can you just explain that, why you're only considering the state of knowledge by reference to those UK-based contractors?
Well, because I've been asked to address the state of knowledge within the UK cladding industry.
Yes.
So it didn't seem relevant, therefore, to consider the major international players.
Yes. Now, considering what you've said about the European and Chinese contractors penetrating the market from at the latest around 2000, can you help us as to whether the domestic cladding industry benefited from the increased knowledge and expertise of those international contractors when they entered the market?
Yes, I would imagine they would, because mostly through interchange of staff. People throughout their careers work for different companies and pick up knowledge from the places they worked.
Yes. So, in your opinion, did the domestic cladding industry benefit in terms of its technical knowledge and expertise from that penetration by international facade contractors?
Yes, I imagine they probably did, yes.
Now, if we can turn to paragraph 2.3.2 on page 16 of your report. You say in section 5, I give a summary of the nature of the UK cladding industry, differentiating between the UK-based cladding contractors dealing with the overcladding projects, such as on Grenfell Tower, and the top-tier international facade contractors. In considering reasonable skill and care, I'm considering that which is applicable to the UK cladding contractors carrying out overcladding work similar to that on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. While the level of technical expertise of such contractors may be slightly less than that of their international counterparts, I consider that the expected level of reasonable skill and care is the same. So you're explaining to us there the approach you've taken, is that right, to the expected level of reasonable skill and care, yes?
Yes.
And even though you've noticed this difference between the technical experience and expertise, you've still applied a consistent standard to that question, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, You say at paragraph 2.4.1, a little bit further down on that same page, 16, you say that in addressing questions about the state of knowledge within the cladding industry, you're not able to provide statistical evidence to back up your opinions and that your views are based on your own experience. Now, do you accept that the state of knowledge within the cladding industry can sometimes be inferred from widespread practices adopted within the industry?
Yes.
And just turning now to manufacturers, I want to ask you some general questions now about the relationship between cladding contractors and manufacturers. If we can look at paragraph 2.2.3 on page 16, sorry, that's this same page, just a bit, that's it, further up. You say here, picking it up a little bit into the first line, a cladding contractor deals with a wide range of products, so would not be expected to be as knowledgeable as the manufacturer for each product. The cladding contractor would therefore rely to a large extent on the information and certification provided by the manufacturer. Now, when you're talking about manufacturers there, just to be clear, are you referring to cladding manufacturers only, or would you include insulation manufacturers there as well?
Yes, I would include manufacturers of all products involved in the process, including insulation manufacturers.
Yes, thank you. And to what extent would you expect a reasonably competent cladding contractor to be reliant on manufacturers for advice about the fire safety of their products?
I think they would be quite reliant upon them. The manufacturers, as I've said, are the people who are dealing very much with their particular product and would be expected to be very conversant with the legislation and about their product. And the cladding contractors would rely on them to a very large extent, unless there was some reason to doubt the advice that they were being given, in which case they might want to take independent advice on that.
Yes, thank you. What about suppliers or fabricators now? To what extent would you expect a reasonably competent cladding contractor to be reliant on suppliers or fabricators of cladding products for advice about the fire safety of those products?
By suppliers, could you just define what you mean by that? As distinct from
effectively
manufacturers?
Middlemen between the manufacturer of, the cladding panels and a supplier,
Okay.
often maybe a supplier and fabricator of those panels.
I wouldn't expect the supplier and fabricator to be particularly knowledgeable on that sort of subject.
Yeah. Now, back to manufacturers, would you expect a manufacturer to volunteer information relating to the fire safety of its products, or simply respond to direct questions from the cladding contractor?
I would expect them mostly to respond to questions from the cladding contractor.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
And can you help us as to why you say that, rather than expecting the manufacturer to be volunteering information about the fire safety of its products?
Well, I'm not commenting here on what is right. I'm only commenting on what I would expect to happen.
I understand.
The manufacturer provides marketing literature and other technical literature and they're trying to sell a product. And generally they're happy to sell it unless questions are asked, and then they answer those questions and so on. So they're not. It's not in their interest to cast doubt about the usefulness of their products, so they wouldn't tend to volunteer information unless they thought it would lead to a sale.
Right. Yes. Would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have enough technical knowledge to be able to interrogate a manufacturer's claims about the fire performance of its products?
Could you repeat the first part of that
Yes.
question?
Would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have enough technical knowledge
Yes.
to be able to interrogate a manufacturer's claims about the fire performance of its product?
Yes, although I would qualify that by saying that if the proposed usage fitted perfectly with the literature provided by the manufacturer,
Yes.
I wouldn't expect them to question it.
Yes.
But I would expect them to question it if they were proposing something which was different or even slightly different from that being proposed for which the technical information applied.
Yes. Yes. And what about a reasonably competent cladding contractor? Would you expect them to be able to pose appropriate questions to be able to fully understand a product's fire performance?
Yes.
Yes. Would you expect a cladding contractor to have a deeper knowledge and understanding about the fire performance of a particular product if that contractor had significant experience of working with a particular cladding product?
Yes.
Yes. And what about, would you expect them to have a deeper knowledge and understanding about the fire performance of a particular product if they designed and installed systems containing such material on several occasions before?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, just some general questions now about how the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have interpreted the building regulations and the guidance in approved document B in the period we're looking at between 2012 and 2017. Later in my questioning, I will be asking you some more specific questions about particular elements of the cladding system at Grenfell Tower, including the ACM and the insulation, with reference to the regulatory framework. But at this stage, these are more general questions about that framework. Do you agree as a general proposition that cladding contractors should have regard to the building regulations, the approved documents and associated guidance as a whole, and so far as possible interpret them consistently with one another?
Yes.
Do you consider that reasonably competent cladding contractors and product manufacturers should have regard to the purpose and intent of the building regulations and the approved documents, where the purpose and intent are clear and apparent? Yes. If we can look at page 61 of your report, at this point, and paragraph 1711, we'll come back to this section of your report later when we're looking specifically at the ACM panels. But just picking up on what you say there, you say, I note, however, that ADB, that's approved document B, the statutory guidance, is not itself the building regulations, and that the 2010 building regulation B41 itself states, and then you set out a quote from that part of the building regulations, from the functional requirements. Now, in your experience and in general terms, can you help us as to what regard was paid to the approved document on fire safety, ADB, in the cladding industry over the period 2012 to 2017?
Well, I think most practitioners in the industry would have given very high regard to ADB 2, and would have regarded that as being the thing that they needed to satisfy, rather than the original building regulation itself.
Yes. So, is it fair to summarise that it was seen by cladding contractors as an authoritative source of guidance to compliance with the building regulations?
Yes.
And did that ever change over that period? Was there, as far as you were aware, ever a time when less attention was paid to approved document B on fire safety, or would that have been consistent throughout?
I wouldn't say that less attention was paid to it, but I think during the period in question, leading up to 2017, I think there was a growing concern about the clarity of guidance given in ADB 2, particularly Section 12.
Yes, yes. I'm going to come back to that. because you make that point in your report, and particularly with reference to some of the other guidance that was available at the time. So I will come back to that. Just sticking with the general point, do you agree that any reasonably competent cladding contractor would have known and understood the fundamental importance of complying with the fire safety requirements concerning the design and construction of an external cladding facade as set out in the building regulations and approved document B?
They would have understood the importance of, did you say?
Yes, the fundamental importance
Yes.
of complying with that.
Yes,
Sorry, it's
absolutely,
a very
yes.
general but
Yes.
important question.
Yes.
Would a reasonably competent cladding contractor expect that if they complied with approved document B, then that would ensure compliance with the functional requirements in the building regulations?
Yes.
Did you yourself ever have experience in any of the projects you worked on of the guidance in approved documents, perhaps in any of them, whether ADB or any of the other guidance documents, becoming out of date compared with good industry practice?
Yes, I suppose, as I said earlier, the sense I had was that the requirements of ADB2, for example, particularly Section 12, as I've
Yes.
mentioned, seemed to me to have been lagging behind what was going on in the rest of the industry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you've given that example. Were you ever aware of any other examples where it was known that if you followed approved document B or any of the other approved documents, that wasn't consistent with good industry practice?
I can't recall any. No.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you consider that when approaching its design work, any...
Could I just make
yes.
just as a general point here? What's interesting in all regulations, codes and standards is that they're never updated on a daily basis. That's the nature of these things, obviously, and they're only updated from time to time. And as technical knowledge progresses, there'll always be a slight time lag.
Yes.
And it's a question of what time lag is reasonable.
Yes.
Really.
Yes, I understand.
And the sense I was getting during those years was the time lag in relation to the lack of clarity on parts of ADB2 was getting unreasonable.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you. Do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have started any design work by considering the functional requirements themselves before moving on to the guidance in approved document B, or would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to go straight to the guidance in ADB?
I would expect the latter.
Yes. Now, in the context of the work of an architect, the inquiry's architectural expert, Mr. Hyatt, has explained that it would be good practice for an architect to prepare a note setting out the key statutory requirements relevant to any design early in the design process. So that's a note for internal purposes at the beginning of a design process, encapsulating what the statutory controls are that the design needs to comply with. Would you expect a reasonably competent cladding contractor to do the same, i.e. to seek to summarise somewhere in a working document the relevant provisions of the building regulations and approved documents or other guidance which were going to be relevant to the design of a particular facade?
I wouldn't necessarily expect them to summarise that in a document, but I would expect them to go through the various requirements in as a sort of checklist and make sure that what was being proposed complied.
Yes.
I wouldn't necessarily expect them to produce a document to that effect.
Right. But would there be some kind of record of that checklist exercise having been carried out in your experience?
I can't recall exactly, but I wouldn't be able to say.
No, fair enough. Now, in your opinion, should a reasonably competent cladding contractor have been familiar with functional requirement B3, which deals with internal fire spread, as well as part B4 on external fire spread?
I wouldn't have thought they would have been so conversant with B3, no.
Do you agree that the reasonably competent cladding contractor ought to have been familiar with Section 9 of Approved Document B, which deals with concealed spaces, cavities, as well as Section 12 of ADB, as both were relevant and applicable to the design and construction of an external cladding facade?
Yes.
Yes. Now, just some questions now about Approved Document B and the routes to compliance within that document. If we could turn first to Section 9 of Approved Document B, which is at CLG 50224 at page 82. So this is Section 9 that I was just referring to, dealing with concealed spaces, cavities. It's under the B3 section of Approved Document B, under the internal fire spread section. And we can see there that paragraph 9.1 begins, it says, concealed spaces or cavities in the construction of a building provide a ready route for smoke and flame spread. This is particularly so in the case of voids in, above and below the construction of a building, e.g. walls, floors, ceilings and roofs. Any spread is concealed. As any spread is concealed, it presents a greater danger than would a more obvious weakness in the fabric of the building. Now, would you expect that the reasonably competent cladding contractor would be aware of the warnings that we see in that paragraph?
Yes. Yes. Could I just add one point here?
Yes.
I notice here that Section 9 occurs within B3.
Yes.
I'd forgotten that. So when I answered earlier that I wouldn't have expected them to have read, to know about B3, I have to modify that by saying that, yes, they should have known about Section 9.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And then we can see a heading below that paragraph, provision of cavity barriers. And at 9.2, it says provisions for cavity barriers are given below for specified locations. The provisions necessary to restrict the spread of flame and flames through cavities are broadly for the purpose of subdividing. And then it talks about subdividing cavities and extensive cavities in the next part. So again, would you expect a reasonably competent cladding contractor to be familiar with the guidance here given for specified locations in terms of cavity barriers?
Yes.
And we can see below that we've got diagram 33, which gives guidance as to where cavity barriers, if we can just scroll down the page and look at diagram 33 in its entirety. Yes, so here we've got guidance within this document about the location of cavity barriers. And then if we go, and we can see that they include, that guidance includes, can you see, it says on the left, close around openings, and you've got grey shading in the cavity there, and also close top of cavity further up that wall line. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we read on to paragraph 9.3 on the following page, we can see that it states there that cavity barriers should be provided to close the edges of cavities, including around openings. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, would you expect that the reasonably competent cladding contractor ought to have been aware of the guidance in diagram 33 and paragraph 9.3 about the need for cavity barriers to close, including around openings?
Yes.
And also, would you expect them to be aware of the guidance on closing the top of a cavity that's given in diagram 33?
Yes.
Now, turning to the guidance on functional requirement B4 in section 12 of ADB, if we can go back to your report at this point, in section 15 of your report on page 55, you have explained at 15.1 there that the building regulations and the applicable guidance document effectively gives 3 routes to compliance within regulation B4. The limitation of external fire spread. And you've explained in the first bullet what you describe, and you can see this at the end of that text, what you describe as the linear route. So that's the guidance in 12.7 and clauses 12.6 to 12.9 of ADB, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then you've given guidance on what you're referring to in your report as the fire test route, which is clause point 5 refers to the BR 135 document and BS 8414 testing, and that's the fire test route, yes?
Yes.
And then you have referred to the fact that much earlier in approved document B, in the introductory paragraphs, clause 0.30 allows fire safety engineering to be carried out, and that could involve a holistic view of the building, which would be an alternative route to compliance. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, in your opinion, would the reasonably competent cladding contractor in the period we're concerned with, 2012 to 2017, have been aware of both the linear route and the BR 1358414 testing route in section 12 of ADB?
Yes.
And in respect of that linear route, would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to understand that assessing whether an external cladding system would adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls required consideration of the fire performance of each of the components of the cladding system, including the particular type of panel and the insulation specified for the system?
Yes.
Yes. And would you also expect them to understand that the requirements of the linear route, I think it follows from your previous answer, but I just want to be clear, that the linear route was cumulative, i.e. compliance with only one of them was not sufficient?
Correct.
Yes, thanks. Now, some questions now about the concept of desktop assessments as a route to compliance. If we can, staying with page 55 of your report and looking at paragraph 15.2, you tell us there, you say limited combustibility is tested if following the national class system in table 7, A7 of ADB in accordance with BS 476 part 11, and then you explain what that requires. And then you go on, recognising that materials of limited combustibility were not always used and considering it to be too onerous to require a system fire test for every external wall type, the Building Control Alliance, BCA, published their technical guidance note 18, first issued June 14 and then issued again in June 15. This is discussed in more detail in section 10.5 of the present report. These documents suggested that a desktop study could be carried out by a competent fire specialist, provided that it was based on an extrapolation from previous relevant fire testing. So you've explained to us the genesis of that desktop study route. And at 15.3 below that, you say, from my experience, there was awareness within the cladding industry of these alternatives. However, on considering what cladding contractors in particular would have been aware of, my opinion is that they would have been mostly aware of either the linear route or the fire test or desk study routes. I do not think they would have normally been aware of the fire safety engineering route, as this would not have been common on the sort of buildings worked upon by UK cladding contractors. Now, can you just help us as to how it was that cladding contractors were aware of the possibility of doing a desktop study as a distinct route of compliance in the relevant period, despite it not being identified separately in ADB? Is that solely because of BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, or was there more a more general awareness in the industry about desktop assessments?
Well, I think it probably originated from Technical Guidance Note 18, but following that, I think the concept of a desktop study seemed to me to be quite common, but it must have originated from that note number 18.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you say the concept was quite common,
well, commonly known. Sorry. Commonly
known, yes. Were you aware of many buildings where the desktop route was followed?
Yes, I think it was not it was because not every building was fire tested, and because not every building followed the linear route. The idea of desktop study as an alternative was not uncommon, and yes, I'm aware of some.
Yes. Now,
sorry, can I just interrupt to ask this? why was it not reasonably feasible for people to follow the linear route if they couldn't follow the fire test route? I mean, why was it necessary to embark on desktop study route at all?
Well, it's interesting because if it may be that testing can show that materials which wouldn't satisfy the linear route could nevertheless be used in the system. For example, it may be within certain constraints that that insulation which was combustible or partly combustible, used in a certain way, could nevertheless pass the test, and therefore one didn't have to go the linear route. And so the desktop study was a way of saying, okay, if the condition I've got is rather similar to one which has already passed the test, then a specialist could say, well, yes, it's going to be all right then.
Although he could presumably have chosen to follow the linear route.
Yes, they could have done.
So
yeah.
there was presumably some economic interest in not doing that.
Yes, I mean, firstly, the cost, doing fire testing is relatively costly. And I guess, interestingly, they wanted to use certain products, and they wouldn't have been able to use certain products if they'd had to follow the linear route because they didn't comply.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think in terms of that last answer, you're thinking particularly of insulation products, which wouldn't have satisfied the limited combustibility requirement in 12.7. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Can you just help us? I think it follows from some of the answers you gave earlier about the complexity of projects, but why it was that the fire safety engineering route, a bespoke engineering route, would not have been common on the sort of buildings worked on by UK cladding contractors.
Well, it's as I understand it, and I'm not. It's quite an uncommon thing to do,
Yeah.
and it tends to be used on complex buildings which don't have regular walls or regular facades, and generally speaking, it involves a level of sophistication which would not have been appropriate to the sort of more routine cladding projects done in the UK.
Yes. Yeah. Now, if we turn to page 59 of your report now, paragraph 17.2, you set out here for us helpfully the text of clause 12.5 of approved document B, which reads, the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread if it is likely to be a risk to health and safety. The use of combustible materials in the cladding system and extensive cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings. So those are the introductory words to 12.5 of ADB. And you say at the beginning of the next paragraph, as written, this clause acts as a general introduction to the requirements. Now, appreciating what you say there about it being a general introduction to what follows in section 12, in your opinion, would the reasonably competent cladding contractor also have read this as a health warning, which should have been borne clearly in mind when the reader was considering the paragraphs which did follow from 12.5?
Yes.
Yeah. And can you help us? What weight or priority ought to have been given to that text there of 12.5 when considering the paragraphs that follow, in your view?
Well, I think the way I would read this, well, the way I think most practitioners in the industry would have read this, is that this is of an introductory nature. It says that the use of combustible materials may present such a risk. It then goes on to specify in more detail in the following clauses what the specific requirements were for the external skins of the building and the insulation and cavity barriers and so on. So I think those more detailed requirements in the mind of the reader would have outweighed the more general introductory requirements of 12.5.
Right, yeah. Now, if we look at the top of page 52 of your report, we can see, if we go to that page there, that you were asked some questions by the inquiry about the awareness and understanding within the cladding industry of certain matters, including National Class Naught, the European classification regime, that's EN 13501, and the BS 8414 test route with the BR 135 criteria. Now, just focusing for a moment on the understanding within the industry of the European classifications and the national classifications, including National Class Naught. If we look at page 53 of your report, in 14.9 at the bottom of that page, you say BS 13501 gives the Euronorm classifications for resistance to fire as discussed above. It uses different test methods from those in BS 8414 parts 1 and 2, and also the classifications are different. And then you say this: in my experience, UK cladding contractors during the period being assessed would not have been familiar with the EN classifications, and they would normally have referred to Class Naught. Manufacturers would probably have had a better understanding of the EN classifications, but would have tailored their approach in the UK to what the UK industry was familiar with, so would have referred mostly to Class Naught. Now, when you say there that the UK cladding contractors would normally have referred to Class Naught, do you mean that the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have been more familiar with the national classifications rather than the European ones?
Yes.
Can you help us as to why that was the position, in your opinion?
I think it was just because of history. I mean, Class Naught predated, from the UK perspective, Class Naught predated the EN classifications, and people hadn't quite absorbed the EN classifications yet. I think in the last 5 years it's probably changed or changing, and things are a little bit different now. But at that time, people were still very much talking about Class Naught.
Yeah, because that's what they were familiar with historically.
Yeah.
We know, however, that diagram 40 of approved document B does refer to the European classifications, so Class B, Class C, as well as the national classifications. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
And were you aware that under UK procurement rules, specifications for public projects were required to be couched in terms of European standards to allow competition from European contractors?
Yes.
Now, taking those points into consideration, would you agree that the reasonably competent cladding contractor ought to have been familiar with the European classifications over the period 2012 to 2017?
Well, this is interesting because you're talking about European procurement rules, and I suspect that the sort of projects we're talking about may have come below the threshold of requiring European procurement. Of requiring the European procurement rules to apply, I'm not sure. But should they have been familiar with those EN standards? Again, some would have been, some weren't. I can't say they should have been.
Right. Even though approved document B is itself referring to those European classifications in diagram 40?
Yes, it does, but it also refers to Class 0, and they probably would have thought, well, that's good enough. If it refers to Class 0, we'll deal with that.
Yes. And in your opinion, did that position change? I mean, you alluded to the fact that there has been an evolution in terms of everybody's thinking, but thinking of the position, say, in 2012, in contrast to the position in, say, 2015, would you have expected there to have been more awareness 3 years later?
Yes, there was a growing awareness.
Yes.
And I would say, yes, it's been growing since then as well, yes.
So can we agree that there would have come a point between 2012 and 2017 when the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have been expected to have at least some familiarity with the European classification system.
Yes.
Yes. And can you help us as to, I know this is a difficult question, but roughly when in time you think that ought to have been the case?
I can't really answer
Okay.
that. So.
Now, you say at paragraph 1411 of your report on page 54, this is staying with the Class 0 point, you say, I think that most cladding contractors considered that Class 0 referred broadly to a fire rating with an emphasis on the surface spread of flame, and that is what I would have expected from a reasonably competent cladding contractor. However, in my experience, that did not apply to all, and occasionally I have come across confusion between the idea of Class 0 and general combustibility. So you say there that you have occasionally encountered confusion between that concept of Class 0 and general combustibility. Can I just clarify precisely what you mean when you're referring to confusion? Do you mean that some cladding contractors thought that Class 0 meant that a product would be non-combustible?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that they thought it was non-combustible, but they thought it conferred some sense of of limited combustibility, I would say.
Yes, and you're using the word limited combustibility not in the technical sense there, but in a more general sense,
more
is
general
that right?
sense, yes.
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 So, say, reduced combustibility, would that be?
Yes.
Yes. Was there a perception in the cladding industry that Class 0 was of relevance to a product's combustibility, that a Class 0 product would not burn or would not burn badly?
I think it was perceived that Class 0 was essentially relating to a surface property of the product, although we know that it's a combination of a surface flame test and another kind of test. But I think, to take your term, there was a perception that it implied that it would not burn badly. Yes.
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 And can you help us as to how that perception had come about?
Well,
What was it that had led people to believe that a Class 0 product would not burn badly?
Well, interestingly, it was the only fire requirement for cladding materials that was in the ADB.
Yes, you mean in 12.6 and diagram 40?
In diagram 40, as
Yeah.
far as the external surface was concerned. And so it was probably perceived that that was the fire requirement. And therefore it was perceived that that was implying that the cladding of a building wouldn't burn so as to cause a problem.
Yes, yes. Now, you've referred to 2 educational courses provided by the Cwct, that's the Centre for Wind.
Strange, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Sorry,
because
yeah.
my mind's working while you're
Yeah.
asking a question. But Mr. Sakula, as far as you know, did people in the cladding industry understand that Class 0 was essentially relating to these properties of the surface of a material, or I think a lining material, not to the body of material?
Yes. That's what was what I've said is that most people, I think, understood that, but I'm not saying everyone did, and I've come across people who perceived that it was some sort of more general fire-resistant classification.
But the fact that you think that most people were aware of its true relevance might be taken to suggest that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would be aware of that.
Yes.
Is that your view?
Yes, that's my view. Yeah.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yes, that's
Sorry,
helpful.
Ms. Green.
No, it's very helpful. Thank you. So you've referred to 2 educational courses provided by the Centre for Window and Cladding Technology, the CWCT, and you've referred to those at paragraph 7.4.2.2 on page 31 of your report. If we can just look at that. So there you're talking about some of the short courses that, and this is relevant to the CWCT, made reference to fire matters. But the main courses wherein fire matters were covered in more detail were, and then you give details of the 2 courses where fire matters were covered in more detail. Now, the first of those is course C101, the Standard for Systemised Building Envelopes, Principles and Specification. And that was a 2-day course which was given between 2007 and 2010, you tell us there, and it included a lecture entitled Fire. Now, I just want to look at the lecture material from that fire section. That's at CWCT 5079, CWCT 5079 at page 4. So there is the fire. Yes, so sorry, there is the class naught section of this fire lecture. So this is a lecture given, just to be clear again, between 2007 and 2010, so earlier than the period we're looking at. And we can see this slide here, which is called Class Naught, and it says Class Naught is not a classification in a British standard method of test. It is defined in the building regulations, which makes use of BS performance ratings to limit both. And then it's got spread of flame across the surface of a material or product, BS 476 Part 7, and the rate of heat release from it, that's BS 476 Part 6. And can we agree here that any person who was the recipient of this course material would have realised that there's no reference to combustibility in the definition here? It's about surface spread of flame and the rate of heat release, yes?
Yes.
And below that is the phrase, is another bullet that reads, such materials / products are generally required to be non-combustible or to have a class 1 surface spread of flame. Now, can I just check, how do you read that? Do you read that as suggesting that it's class 0 materials or products were generally required to be non-combustible or have a class 1 surface spread of flame?
Yes, but I would also say that the definition of class 0 requires a class 1 surface spread of flame plus a certain rating in terms of heat release in accordance with Part 6.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And then if we can turn to the second course that you've referred to in your report, if we go back to page 31 of your report, 7.4.2.2, you've referred to a course CWDC, Curtain Wall Design and Construction for Building Professionals. That was a 4-day course given from 2007 onwards, so again, several years before the period we've particularly looked at, and included a lecture entitled Fire Performance of Facades. And if we can look at the slides for that lecture, that's at CWCT 5083. We can see that this is a lecture called The Fire Performance of Facades. And if we turn to page 6, we can see a slide entitled Spread of Flame this time, and it refers to class 0. Do you see that there in the first, BS 476? And then if we go on to page 7, we can see exactly the same information is given about the nature of class 0, precisely what is tested, and that they're generally required to be non-combustible or have a class 1 surface spread of flame, yes?
Yes.
So bearing those course materials from the CWCT in mind, and just to be absolutely clear about your evidence, and I think this follows from your answer to the chairman's questions, but I'm going to pose it nevertheless. Do you consider that a reasonably competent cladding contractor ought not to have been confused as between class 0 and the combustibility of a material or product?
Correct.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, just looking at the time, I'm about to move to a different topic, which is about other key industry
Would
guidance
you like to have a break at that point?
documents. Yes, please. This
Yes.
would be a good moment.
All right, Mr. Sakula, you probably know we have a break during the morning and the afternoon, and this is a good time to take it, so we shall take it now. We'll resume at 11:30, and I think I should say the same to you as I've said to others. Please don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're out of the room. All right, thank you very much. Would you like to go to the usher?
Thank you.
Half past 11 then.
Thank you.
Yes, would you ask Mr. Sakula to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. Sakula, ready to carry on?
Yes, thanks.
Good, thanks. Yes, Ms. Granger.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Mr. Sakula.
Before, can I just add something just before you
Of
kick
course,
off?
yes, please.
I was thinking about an answer I gave to a question earlier when you were asking me about what date there was the sort of transition took place between the knowledge of class 0 and the more Euronorm approach.
Yes.
And I was thinking it was probably more like 2017.
Right.
And the reason I say that is because I remembered during the break that the Cwct had published a technical note at
Yes.
the beginning of 2017,
Yes.
which made a comparison between the Euronorms and the British Standard
Yes.
classifications. So that would have been around the time when there was a growing awareness
Yes.
of that.
Yes, is that Technical Guidance Note 98? I
Yes.
think? Yes. Yeah, and I'll take you to that guidance
Oh, okay.
at some point. Yes. No, but that's extremely helpful. Thank
All
you.
right.
Yes.
All
So I now want to ask you some questions about some of the industry guidance documents that you consider in your report and which are relevant to the knowledge that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have had in the relevant period. And if we can start with the BR 135 publication, that is referred to, as we know, in clause 12.5 of ADB. And if we turn to page 41 of your report, paragraph 10.3.2, you say, well, actually, let's pick it up at 10.3.1. BR 135 is a report by the Building Research Establishment entitled Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings. Following the first edition dated 1988, there was a second edition in 2003 and a third edition dated 2013. And then you go on in the next paragraph. BR 135 third edition contains 2 annexes, A and B, setting out in detail the method by which fire performance results of testing to BS 8414 parts 1 and 2 may be classified. And then you make clear there in parentheses the second edition had contained only Annex A dealing with masonry backing walls, since at the time of publication 8414 part 2 had not been published. And you go on, it is these performance criteria which are specifically referenced in ADB 2, clause 12.5, and that gives BR 135 great importance in assessing the question of compliance with ADB 2. Now, so in a nutshell, would it be fair to say that you attribute great importance to the BR 135 document, in large part because it is expressly referred to in paragraph 12.5 of approved document B?
Yes.
And you then go on and say this at 10.3.3, just below that. I would expect most specialist cladding contractors in the period January 2012 to June 2017 to have been aware of the existence of BR 135, second or third edition, because of its reference in clause 12.5 of ADB. I would imagine, however, that most of them would not have read it or understood exactly how the tests were classified. Some of the more conscientious and technically aware specialists would probably have studied BR 135 and so would have had a better understanding of how the classifications were made. So in that paragraph, you are explaining the extent to which you think, in fact, specialist cladding contractors would or would not have read and studied that document, BR 135. Focusing now on what a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have done if involved in an overcladding project like Grenfell Tower. In your opinion, would a reasonably competent specialist cladding contractor have read the main guidance in BR 135, not the annexes, but the main guidance in that document, even if they would not have understood precisely the tests or their classifications?
Well, it's as I've said in my report. I think the more conscientious technical people would have done would I wouldn't like to say that I would have expected all reasonably competent cladding contractors to have read it.
Yes.
I simply say that I would have expected them to have been aware of its existence.
Right.
I mean, would it be fair to say that as far as the cladding contractor is concerned, he needs to be aware of what you called earlier the fire test approach, but he didn't need to be aware of the complexities or the details of it, because either he was going to be presented with a document from somebody well qualified to say it has passed a BS 8414 and BR 135 requirements, or he's not.
Yes.
So for him, the no doubt interesting technical aspects of BR 135 weren't really essential to get on top of, were they?
Yes, I think that's what I would agree with that. It's not to say that there's a lot of good information in BR 135. It's just that I wouldn't say that I would condemn them for not having read it all. That's the word.
Yes.
Yes, all right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yes, just following on from that, it's right, isn't it, that BR 135 contains a lot of general information about external fire spread and the risks posed by it, as well as technical detail about the testing and the classifications of the testing.
Yes.
Yes. If we just look at BR 135, the third edition for a moment, so this is the one dated 2013. It's at BRE 4 zeros, then 4 fives, so 0000 5555. And if we go to the next page, we can see there it is, the third edition, fire performance of external thermal insulation for walls of multi-storey buildings. And if we turn to page 13, here we can see a diagram giving, it's figure 3, mechanisms for external fire spread by way of the external cladding system. And we can see it's graphically illustrating there what can happen where you get flaming on or near the facade and the ways in which that can break out and then spread up the facade and break back in. Yes?
Yes.
And then on page 14, the next page, there are a number of warnings. So if we look at section 3.3 here, interaction with the external envelope, if we pick it up 3 lines down in that paragraph, it says, once flames begin to impinge upon the external fabric of the building from either an internal or an external source, there is the potential for the external cladding system to become involved and to contribute to the external fire spread up the building by the following routes. And then a number of routes are identified. Immediately below that, we see 3.3.1, surface propagation. The reactant to fire characteristics of the materials used within the external cladding system will influence the rate of fire spread up the building envelope by way of the surface of the external cladding system. And then below that, we can see it says 3.3.2 cavities. Cavities may be incorporated within the external system or may be formed by the delamination or differential movement of the system in a fire. And then reading on in that right-hand bottom column, if flames become confined or restricted by entering cavities within the external cladding system, they will become elongated as they seek oxygen and fuel to support the combustion process. This process can lead to flame extension of 5 to 10 times that of the original flame lengths, regardless of the materials used to line the cavities. This may enable fire to spread rapidly, unseen, through the external cladding system if appropriate fire barriers have not been provided. Now, appreciating what you've said about whether a reasonably competent cladding contractor should have read this document in any detail, concentrating on those particular features that I just took you to and those warnings about the potential for external fire spread, including in cavities, would you have expected a reasonably competent cladding contractor to have appreciated those potential features of fire spread in cladding systems?
Yes, I would.
Yes. So even though they may not have read this cover to cover, you would have expected them to have been aware of those features, including, for example, flame elongation in cavities.
I think the specific example of flame elongation is quite specialised, and it's possible they wouldn't have been aware of that. But the other points made about the potential for fire to travel through up and around the external cladding system, I think they would have understood that. But specifically about flame elongation, perhaps not.
Yes. And when you say they would have understood that, should they have understood that if they were embarking on a cladding project of the like of Grenfell Tower?
Yes.
Yes. Now, going back to your report at page 41, section 10.3, you say at 10.3.3 there, you say, I would expect most cladding contractors in the period January, sorry, we've just read this, and you say that most would have not have read or understood exactly how the tests were classified. Some more conscientious would probably have studied it. Now, focusing now on the tests under BS 8414 and how they were classified according to BR 135, do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor, or at least someone within its organisation, should have understood how the tests were classified under BR 135, i.e. that there was pass-fail criteria?
I'm sure they would have known there were pass-fail criteria, but they may not have known the details of how they were arrived at.
Right, but ought they to have understood that once tested to BS 8414, there would then need to be a separate process of classification of the system under BR 135?
Yes, because that's what ADB 2 says.
Yes. And how much should that reasonably competent cladding contractor have understood about how those classifications were arrived at in relation to the system?
Well, as I said, I don't think they would have understood the details of how those particular classifications were arrived at.
Right. But would they have understood that there would be a mechanism for assessing the extent of flame spread across that facade as part of that system, as part of that classification examination?
Yes, to be clear, as I understand it, BR 135 talks about pass or failure,
yes,
rather than classification. And they would have understood that it's a fire test. I'm not sure it was specifically about flame spread only. It was an overall fire test.
Yes, and it's about temperature rise, etc.
Yes.
There's other aspects of it.
Yes.
So to what extent would they have had an understanding of what you would need to do to pass that fire test?
They would have had an understanding that a test needed to be carried out on a full-scale sample.
Yes.
They may not have understood the requirement, the pass-fail criteria relating to a certain temperature being reached at a certain height above the fire.
Yes.
They may not have understood that specifically, but they would have understood the general principle that it was a full-scale fire test.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you. Looking at page 49 of your report now, we can see at the top of the page, you were asked some questions, and you've set them out at the very top of the page, about the extent to which it was common for specialist cladding contractors to request fire test evidence from manufacturers or suppliers of cladding products. And we can see further down the page, at sub-question B on that page, you were asked how common was it for specialist cladding designers or contractors to ask manufacturers of cladding products for information relating to their fire test performance, in addition to that contained in publicly available product literature. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you answer at 12.2 below that, You say this, you say, I cannot answer this question directly as I am unsure how common it would have been in practice for cladding designers or contractors to seek further fire test information. However, I would have expected them to seek further information if their proposed system did not conform exactly to the system for which any test certificate was issued. So, do you agree that it would be important that cladding contractors did understand enough about BR 135 and 8414 testing to be able to assess whether their system conformed to the system for which a test certificate had been issued?
Yes, I was, in writing this, I was thinking more about the BBA certificate and that, rather than any certificate produced by the test house, if you like, because they just give a report rather than a certificate.
Yes.
But all I'm saying here is that if the tested system matched exactly what was being proposed to be built, I wouldn't expect them to go back and question the test.
Yes.
Whereas if there were some variation being proposed, then I would expect them to be questioning more what was the original test based on.
Yeah. And would you expect them to understand that if going down the BR 135 8414 route, their system needed to replicate precisely the system that was tested?
Yes.
Yes. So they'd need to know that much about it.
Yes.
Now, another set of guidance documents that you refer to are BS quadruple 9 from 2008 and BS 9991 from 2011. Yeah. And if we look at page 40 of your report, paragraph 10.2.3, you helpfully explain here that these codes of practice contain information covering a range of topics relating to fire. Taking BS 9991 as an example, there are 10 sections. For the purposes of a cladding contractor, the important part, in my opinion, is section 6, covering design for construction. This section repeats much information from ADB 2, but is not identical. For example, clause 29.2 is headed external fire spread over the external faces of buildings. Among other things, it states, and then you've given us the quote from BS 9991. It says, this, control of flame spread, is particularly important where a stay-put strategy is in place. Combustible materials should not be used in cladding systems and extensive cavities. So you've noted that there's that particular piece of guidance in BS 9991, which we don't have in ADB 2, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Let's look at that in BS 9991. This is in the 2015 version, which we find at BSI 6059. We can see the full title of that British Standards Institute publication, Fire Safety in the Design, Management and Use of Residential Buildings Code of Practice. And then on at section 18.2 on page 86, we can see, if we read just the first few paragraphs under 18.2, that's headed external fire spread over the external faces of buildings. It states there, external walls should be constructed using a material that does not support fire spread and therefore endanger people in or around the building. Flame spread over or within an external wall construction should be controlled to avoid creating a route for rapid fire spread, bypassing compartment floors or walls. And then there's a note 1. It says there, this is particularly important where a stay-put strategy is in place. Now, based on your experience, would a reasonably competent cladding contractor have an awareness of and an understanding of this part of BS 9991?
I don't think they would have been aware of this particular part in a general sense.
Right.
I do think, had it been referred to in their specification or contract documents, they would have been made aware of it in that way. But in a general sense, I don't think they would have been aware of this.
Yes. More generally, would they understand what a stay-put strategy was and its significance in the context of external facade design?
I can't really say.
Right.
You would have thought so, but I'm speculating about what a third party understood by something.
I understand.
I don't know.
But to your knowledge, was a stay-put strategy something that was understood in the cladding industry between 2012 and 2017 in terms of what that meant?
I can't answer categorically, but I would say on the balance of probabilities, probably yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And you suggest at 10.2.5 at page 41 of your report, actually we don't need to go to it, but actually there it is on the screen, that you would expect, I think this follows from what you've just said, you would expect a cladding contractor to be aware of the existence of BS 9991 and BS 999, but not to be familiar with their contents, yes?
Yes. Mainly because, as I've said, because much of the information, in fact most of the information, is a repeat of the requirements of ADB2,
yeah.
They probably wouldn't have thought it's particularly significant to read these in detail.
Yeah. So would it only be where their specific contract documents had that as a listed specification that you would expect them to consult it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, and you make that point at 10.2.5 on page 41. It's there in front of us. You say, picking it up 3 lines down, however, if the documents were specifically referenced in the cladding contractor's contract or the specification, I would expect the cladding contractor to have referred to them and in particular to have read clauses, and then you give particular clauses which are relevant to external flame spread in those documents. In your experience, were these British standards routinely included in a cladding contractor's contract or were they routinely omitted?
From memory, I would say it was typical to include them.
Yeah. Just thinking more generally, and not specifically about these British standards, but more generally about guidance, would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor who subcontracts some or all of their work package, say the design element, say that's subcontracted to another contractor, would you expect them to have referred that subcontractor to any guidance documents or standards that were in the contractor's contract?
Sorry, could you say the first part of your question?
Yeah, so where you have a reasonably competent cladding contractor who subcontracts some or all of their package of work, say including the design element,
yes,
to another party, would you have expected them to have referred the subcontractor to any guidance documents or standards that were in the contractor's contract?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have a system to ensure that these were appropriately considered by the relevant subcontractor?
Yes.
And would you also expect the cladding contractor to have a supervisory system to ensure that the work produced was compliant with statutory compliance as well as any relevant guidance documents or standards?
Yes.
So some form of checking regime which went beyond simply ensuring that a subcontracted designer kept to programme, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And what steps would you expect the reasonably competent cladding subcontractor to undertake to ensure supervision? Sorry, I'll start that question again. What steps would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to undertake to ensure supervision of a design subcontractor was adequate from a technical perspective?
I think they would have to list from the specification the key elements that had to be met, and also go over the requirements of building regulations that had to be met, and produce some sort of checklist, I suppose.
Yes.
And then when the design came back, they would have to check that they can conform with that checklist.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's helpful. Now, just staying with the general topic of guidance, industry guidance, now turning to guidance produced by the Cwct, the Centre for Windows and Cladding Technology. If we go to page 42 of your report, paragraph 10.4.2, you tell us there that the Cwct has in 2020 more than 350 members comprising mainly architects, consultants, main contractors, specialist contractors, suppliers and manufacturers. Of these, specialist contractors represent about 40% of the membership, which is a significant proportion. So that's what you tell us there about membership of the Cwct. Just in more general terms, how well known was the Cwct amongst cladding contractors in the period 2012 to 2017?
I would say it was very well known.
Yes. And what were the reasons why it was very well known?
Well, because it was a technical umbrella organisation for the UK cladding industry, and it did all sorts of things. It produced technical reports, it ran courses, and it had an MSc program in facade engineering. A lot of people did that in the industry.
Yes.
I would say it would be very surprising if any cladding contractor wasn't aware of it.
Yes.
It was a central body for the UK facade and cladding industry.
And does it follow that any guidance that was issued by the Cwct was generally very closely looked at by cladding contractors?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, if the contract or specification for the project required compliance with the CWT's standard for systemised building envelopes, and we know that that standard was dated September 2008. Let's just pull it up on the screen so we can see it. It's at CWCT 5046. So that's the standard for systemised building envelopes. It's dated, the date's not on this front page, but I can tell you it's dated 2008, and it has Part 6 fire performance within it, as you can see on that front page. Now, if the contract or specification for the project required compliance with this standard, do you agree that any reasonably competent cladding contractor would read and seek to understand that standard, including Part 6 fire performance?
Yes.
And you've told us, we don't need to go to this, that you've told us for the transcript, this is at 10.4.4 on page 42 of your report, that the CWCT standard, this one, the standard for systemised building envelopes, was the most important document produced by the Cwct. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so.
And can you explain why it was the most important?
Well, it was wide-ranging. Firstly,
Yeah.
They produced all sorts of technical notes and technical updates as well, but they were on very specific subjects. This was quite a wide-ranging standard which covered the whole of the facade. But also, in the absence of a British standard which covered the whole of the facade, this became de facto the British standard.
Yeah. And would you have said that most reasonably competent cladding contractors would have thought of this as effectively akin to a British standard in this field?
Yes.
Yeah. And just to be clear, so it was more important than, for example, there was a guide to good practice for facades, which was published by the Cwct in 1996 and reprinted in 2002, yes?
yes, I would have thought this is more important.
Yes, because it's more wide-ranging and comprehensive.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the point is, this had the status of a standard, whereas Guide to Good Practice doesn't have quite that same formality.
Yes, I understand. There was also a standard for walls with ventilated rain screens published in July 1998. Are you aware of that CWCT publication?
Yes.
Yes. But again, you'd still say this was the most important one.
Yes.
And if we go to your report now at page 42, where you're dealing with this CWCT's, the Systemised Building Envelope Standard, you tell us at paragraph 10.4.5, so if we can just scroll down a little bit. So you say the overall standard, known for short as the CWCT standard, was very well known to practitioners in the cladding industry. In the absence of a BS or EN dealing with facades as a whole, the CWT standard became the de facto standard for the UK facade industry, which is evident from the fact that it was often referenced in specifications. I would expect all cladding contractors to have been aware of its contents in detail, particularly those who were members of the CWCT. This expectation would have included Part 6 dealing with fire performance. Now, if this was effectively the de facto standard, can you explain to us how a reasonably competent cladding contractor would approach this guidance in comparison with the practical guidance that you get in ADB? How would the two sit alongside one another, and what would be the weight given to each by a competent cladding contractor?
It's interesting because ADB 2 is itself a guidance document, in effect. It's guidance to how the requirements of the building regulations can be met.
Yes.
And I think, in terms of weight, the ADB 2 would have been considered to be the weightier document. That was something that had to be complied with. I think that's how it would have been perceived, not least because that's what the building control officer would have referred to as the point of reference for compliance. And although the CWCT standard is more comprehensive by a long shot, the ADB 2 would have carried more weight in the cladding contractor's mind, I think.
Yes, I understand. And then if we look at 10.4.7, also on page 42, that's further down, you explained that there was something called Technical Note 73, Fire Performance of Curtain Walls and Rain Screens, was published in March 2011 and gives an important summary. So this is as part of a technical note series. And you say, I would expect all cladding contractors to have been aware of its contents, particularly those who were members of the CWCT. And then you go on and tell us some particularly important parts of that. And we'll come back to that about insulation material. So you go on and highlight two particular excerpts from Technical Note 73 in the top of that page 43. But to confirm, is it your evidence that you would expect a cladding contractor to be familiar with the entire contents of Technical Note 73, not just these warnings?
Yes.
If we turn to that Technical Note 73 from March 2011, that's at CWCT 5019 at page... Yeah, if we just turn up to the front page first. There we have it. We can see the date in the bottom right-hand corner, March 2011. And if we could look at page 5, we can see in the bottom left-hand column of page 5 and over to the next column, we can see a paragraph where it says, cavity barriers may be tested following the principles of BS 476 Part 20 or BS EN 1366 Part 4. Tests are generally constructed with the barrier in a cavity between walls of fire-resisting construction, and performance with rain screen panels may be different. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have any familiarity with those test standards that I just read out there, They're at the bottom of the left-hand column. That was BS 476 Part 20 and BS EN 1366 Part 4. Those are fire resistance tests. Would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have any familiarity with those fire resistance tests?
No.
No. But just to be clear, that part that I then read out at the top of the right-hand column, where it says that tests are generally constructed with the barrier in a cavity between walls of fire-resisting construction and performance with rain screen panels may be different, you would have expected the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have appreciated that, would you?
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's intuitively obvious whether or not it's written here. Yeah.
I appreciate you're saying it's intuitively obvious.
Yeah.
Can you just explain that for us, why you say that?
Well, because if they're differentiating between walls of fire-resisting construction,
Yes.
that's you would expect that behaviour in fire to be different from that of a rain screen panel.
Yes. I see.
That's all.
Yeah. Now, going to your conclusions of your report and staying with the CWCT standards, this is page 67 and paragraph 20.14. So looking at 20.14, you tell us that the CWCT, based in Bath, is the main technical umbrella organisation for facade technology in the UK. I would expect all cladding contractors to have been aware of the contents of the CWCT standard, that's the standard for systemised building envelopes, in detail, and to have been aware of the subjects covered by the CWCT technical notes, reading specific notes as required. And you go on and say, for example, technical note 73. So just to be absolutely clear, would it be fair to say that you would expect all reasonably competent cladding contractors to have considered both the CWCT standard for systemised building envelopes and technical note 73 if they were designing an overcladding of a, say, high-rise building?
Yes.
And that would include throughout the period 2012 to 2017, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And can you just confirm to us that these CWCT standards and the guidance was readily available on the CWCT's website throughout that time?
It was available to members of the CWCT, not
Right.
to the general public.
Right.
But the technical notes were available free of charge.
Yes.
The standard, I can't remember whether you had to pay for it or not, but I can't remember whether that came with the charge or not. Okay. It was a much more voluminous document.
But if you remember, you would easily have access to it.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. The Building Control Alliance now, the BCA. I want to ask you now about BCA Technical Guidance Note 18. If we look at page 44 of your report, paragraph 10.5.2, you say there, in the light of perceived uncertainty about fire requirements for facades of buildings with a floor above 18 metres within the facade industry during the period being assessed, the BCA published the following documents, and then you give Technical Guidance Note 18, Issue 0, June 2014, and Issue 1, June 2015. And you tell us these documents are very similar, except that in Issue 1, the 18-metre height is clarified as being to the highest floor rather than the height of the building. Also, in Issue 1, the option of a holistic fire engineering is introduced as a fourth option for showing compliance with ADB 2. Now, going back to the first line of that paragraph, where you say that there was a perceived uncertainty about fire requirements, which led to this BCA publication. Can you just help us? What precisely was the perceived uncertainty that you're referring to there?
Well, I'm referring to the fact that Section 12 of ADB2 wasn't particularly clear in what it meant.
Right. And it's your understanding, is it, that it's that then led to the BCA entering the field and giving guidance in this way?
Yes, I would also add that I think also there must have been and this is to some extent speculation, but there was probably a bit of a backlash about the industry thinking, well, do we have to test every facade for every condition? And the BCA came up with this idea of a desktop study as a means of getting around the fact that not every system had to be tested, so that an intelligent, specialised assessor could say, well, the system you're proposing is sufficiently similar to the one that's been tested that will allow it to pass building control.
Yes.
So I think it was probably in response to that
Yes, I understand. And
pushback from the industry that TGN 18 came out.
And were you actually aware yourself at the time of some pushback within the industry? You began that answer by saying it's to some extent speculation. Were you aware that there was some pushback?
Yes, I think I was aware at the time, yes.
If we can look at that BCA technical guidance note, at BCA 701, this is the first issue, which is issue 0, dated June 2014. We can see that from the top right-hand little box. Mm-hmm. And we can see under the heading purpose that what it tells us is it says the BCA technical guidance notes are for the benefit of its members and the construction industry, mm-hmm, to provide information, promote good practice and encourage consistency of interpretation for the benefit of our clients. So is it right and was it well understood that these guidance notes were intended for a broader audience than simply building control officers or members of the BCA?
Yes.
And in your experience, would the reasonably competent cladding contractor have been in receipt of updates from the Building Control Alliance, from the BCA?
Well, yes, as I've said in my report, it's hard to say for sure how they would have received this information. Certainly within the consultancy world, I think we were aware of this. I would imagine that the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have been aware of it because it would have been in their interest to be aware of it. But I can't provide any actual evidence for how they would have been aware of it.
Yes. And just to be clear, we don't need to turn it up in your report, but as you've just referred to, at paragraph 10.5.5 on page 44, you say you're unclear exactly how cladding contractors would have been alerted to their existence, except by word of mouth among peers and through the relevant technical press. Yes. Is it possible that one example of the way in which a cladding contractor may have become aware of this guidance is through, for example, updates published by the National House Building Council, the NHBC? Yes,
if they included this this material in that, yes.
Yes, let's look at an example. If we can go to SIG 50482. This is an article taken from the web, which was published by, we believe, an organisation called Adjacent Government. And we can see under the picture of the tall building, it's headed Combustible Cladding Material on Residential Buildings, dated the 9th of February 2015. Mm-hmm. And here it says the Building Control Alliance has recently published new guidance in respect of using combustible insulation materials to residential buildings over 18 metres in height. Steve Evans at NHBC outlines what this means, and you can see if you go over to the second page that it's got his name at the bottom, Steve Evans, Senior Area Technical Manager for the NHBC. So this is an article that he's written and that's found its way onto this website. Mm-hmm. Is this the kind of update or article in the relevant technical press that you might expect a reasonably competent cladding contractor to receive, which would draw their attention to the BCA guidance?
Yes.
Yes. And you tell us at paragraph 20.15 of your report on page 667 that, in my opinion, we don't need to turn it up, a reasonably competent cladding contractor working on tall buildings would have been aware of this through conversations with peers or communications from the Cwct and would have read it. Now, we've seen in your report that you're unclear as to exactly how contractors would have been alerted to the existence of it. But considering that, can you just help us on what basis you formed the view that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have been aware of its existence and would have read it?
To some extent, it's a sort of deduction from the fact that the concept of a desktop study was well known at the time, and this TGN 18 is the document that introduces that concept.
Yes.
So one would assume that, therefore, people who talked about desktop studies, including cladding contractors, must be aware of TGN 18.
Yes. Yes, I understand. Thank you.
That's it, really.
Yes. Now, finally, I want to ask you about the LABC, Local Authority Building Control, another organisation. And you refer at paragraph, so on page 45 of your report, if we could go to that now, you refer at paragraph 10.7.1 to something called the LABC Warranty Technical Manual. Mm-hmm. And you tell us that that there is a clause 7.7.2, there's a requirement there that curtain walling systems should have third-party certification confirming satisfactory assessment in accordance with the Cwct standard for curtain walling. And then it says the Cwct standard provides detailed guidance on performance and testing. And you go on to tell us at the top of the following page that although this clause uses the phrase curtain walling systems, in the context it's used, you would understand this to apply to cladding as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, we just wanted to take you to somewhere in that LABC Warranty Technical Manual where a similar statement is in fact made about cladding. If we could turn to that LABC document, that's LABC 307892 at page 197. So this is slightly further on. We can see it's chapter 7, and we can see at the top this is from the LABC Warranty Technical Manual. And on the right-hand side, there's a section headed 7.7.5, rain screen cladding systems. Do you have that?
Yes.
And there's some text there. And if we turn over to page 198, still in the same section, it says right in the top left-hand corner, rain screen systems should have third-party certification confirming satisfactory assessment and comply with the requirements of the Cwct standard for systemised building envelopes. The collation of individual testing of components does not provide an overall performance of the rain screen or backing wall. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So can we agree that even if the curtain walling section of the LABC Warranty Technical Manual did not apply to the cladding or rain screen cladding, this section incorporates the same requirement, including to comply with the Cwct standard for systemised building envelopes?
Yes.
Yeah. And also to have third-party certification, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, just stepping back and thinking about industry guidance documents and standards more generally, would you agree that guidance documents and indeed more formal standards can quickly go out of date once they are published.
Yes.
Do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor has an obligation to interrogate and question guidance and standards?
I think it would depend on the date. If you were looking at if you were in 2013, for example, you were looking at a standard dated 2010,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have any particular reason to question it. If you were looking at one dated 1980, you would be foolish not to question it.
Yeah.
So,
Do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor ought to be able to identify where it was clear that particular guidance had become out of date compared with other industry guidance?
sorry, I missed the first part of your question.
Yeah. Do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor ought to be able to identify where it was clear that particular guidance had become out of date compared with other industry guidance?
It's tricky to answer that.
Yeah, I do understand that. It's a very hypothetical question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it isn't a problem, but it's a matter of judgment.
Yes.
And as time passes, I think in the light of what you said earlier, as time passes, it will become more apparent that an old standard needs to be questioned.
Yes.
Yeah.
At what point you could say everyone should have questioned it is probably debatable, isn't it?
Yes, and it depends on the particular technical issue involved, I would say. Like most things, it depends on context. I can't make a general answer to the question.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on. I want to ask you some questions now about the industry's knowledge of the fire performance of particular products and of fires more generally involving cladding.
Yeah.
If we can go to page 34 of your report first and look at paragraph 8.2.1. This is under the section State of Knowledge of the Cladding Industry. You've set out there helpfully for us a table of 3 different types of insulation board: extruded polystyrene XPS, polyisocyanurate PIR foam, and the phenolic foam. And below that, at 8.2.2, you say this. You say all of these products are combustible to a greater or lesser degree. While fire specialists would probably have been able to rank these in terms of fire propagation and smoke generation, in my experience, the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have known that they were combustible, but would not have been able to rank their combustibility. So that's what you tell us there.
Mm-hmm.
So just to be clear, when you talk about fire specialists being able to rank the products, do you mean that they would be able to examine the test data and classifications for each product and determine an order, say, of combustibility or an order of smoke production?
Yes.
Yeah. And you've told us very clearly there that the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have known that these insulation products were combustible but would not have been able to rank them. Would it follow from that the reasonably competent cladding contractor should have understood that the use of such combustible materials on a building over 18 metres in height entailed a fire risk?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the knowledge within the industry of cladding fires, if we could turn to page 35 of your report. Here, you've set out, very helpfully again, a table of what you describe in paragraph 9.1 as a number of important fires involving external fire spread. And you've given us the date, the location, and notes about what was known about those fires. And that table goes from page 35 over, if we could just have a look onto page 36. So it takes us right up through to June 2016. And going back to page 35, the first fire in which you specifically refer to ACM is the the China fire from February 2011. It's 4 lines up.
Yeah.
At the Wangsing complex. And the details you've given under the notes column, it says ACM panels involved and both extruded and expanded polystyrene insulation. Now, would it be fair to say, therefore, that prior to 2012, the fire risks posed by ACM panels were not well known within the industry?
Yes, and particularly this fire in China would not have been publicised particularly. I think when these problems became known was once the fires started happening in the Middle East.
Yes.
Which, as you say, is about 2012.
Yes, so we can see immediately below that,
Yeah.
April 2012, the Al-Taya Tower in Sharjah in the UAE. Fire started 8th floor, 40 stories, ACM panels. And then we've got the Roubaix, France fire, the Mermots Tower, May 2012. Fire broke out, 2nd story, 18 stories, 1 died, ACM cladding. So that's, I think what you're saying is that's really at the time when this was becoming much more well known. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if we look at paragraph 9.2 of your report on page 36, you say there, I have listed the above, but I would not expect all practitioners in the cladding industry to have been aware of all of these at the time. Nevertheless, the ones that would, in my opinion, have been more widely known were the fires in the United Arab Emirates, particularly in Dubai in 2012 to 2016, because they were well covered in the news media and technical press at the time. And then you go on to tell us at 9.3, for example, the UAE fires were well covered by the local and international online media. They were also reported online on bbc.com and on itv.com and within the technical online feeds such as the architectsjournal.com, building.com and constructionweek.com. Although I cannot provide specific contemporaneous evidence, it is in my opinion highly likely that news of these fires would also have been covered by the relevant broadcast TV news programmes and in the print editions of the above magazines. Finally, I would expect local agents dealing with importation of cladding and insulation materials to the UAE to have been aware of these fires from their local media and to have informed their relevant suppliers accordingly. Now, just going back to 9.2 and where you tell us that you would have expected the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have been aware of some of the fires in this table. Is it only the UAE fires that you would have expected them to be aware of, or would you expected them to be aware of at least some of the others as well?
I would have expected them to have been aware of the UAE fires. They might have been aware of some of the others, but I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah. Now, it's been suggested to the inquiry that cladding assemblies in the UAE may have been different to the type of cladding assemblies typically used in the UK. Is that something that you're aware of or you can help us with?
You're saying in some of the other evidence, or some?
So, no, this is actually it's been suggested in some questions for you that,
Yes.
For example, in the UAE, typically cladding assemblies did not have insulation, and those that did had a thin layer of glass wool or stone wool. Can you help us with that?
No, I can't, I'm afraid.
No, fair enough.
But I'm slightly surprised at that, because although obviously it's a different climate, the insulation requirements are still there because you're trying to keep the cool of the building in.
Yes, yes.
You know, it's because they're heavily air conditioned. But I'm not sure what the point being made is about the fact that the cladding construction is different. Why?
I think someone's suggesting that maybe because the cladding construction was different, that perhaps people wouldn't have been paying as much attention in the UK to those fires.
Well, you haven't asked the question, but if you're asking why do I think people weren't paying enough attention, can I?
I'm coming to that in a moment.
Okay, because I've got a view on that, but
yeah.
but I don't think the difference of construction was the issue.
Right,
No.
yes. Just sticking with this for a moment, it's also been suggested that none of those UAE fires involved cladding systems which attempted to compartmentalise the system, the cladding system, for example, through the use of cavity barriers. Again, can you help us whether that's correct or not?
I don't know.
And does it remain your evidence, as stated at paragraph 9.4 on page 37? If we can just look at 9.4. You say the UAE fires were reported at the time as being specifically exacerbated by the ACM cladding. One relevant article among many is in the Building magazine. Those involved in the cladding industry would, or at least should, have been aware of the dangers inherent in using this type of cladding on tall buildings.
Yes.
So does it remain your evidence, notwithstanding whether there were any differences in the detail of those cladding systems, that the reasonably competent cladding contractor ought to have been aware of the fire dangers inherent in using ACM cladding?
Yes.
Would those dangers have included the knowledge that metal cladding has a propensity to melt and deform, thereby exposing the core of any composite panel?
I would say probably, but I wouldn't be able to say categorically.
Yeah. And would an awareness of the dangers have included the knowledge that cavity barriers might well be futile because the cladding panel can deflect and deform and warp under heating, meaning there'd be nothing for the cavity barrier to abut against? Do you consider that that would have been understood?
No, I'm not sure where that's coming from because I mean, there are things called intumescent cavity barriers which expand when they're heated. So they wouldn't necessarily have the effect that you're describing.
Yes, I think it's being suggested that even with intumescent cavity barriers, that it would be known that they may well be futile because even with an intumescent strip, the cladding panel can still deflect and deform and warp, allowing the flame to bypass the barrier.
Yes, after a certain time.
Yes.
Because, the cavity barrier is only typically designed for 30 minutes operation. So after that time, there would be distortion, yes.
What about before that time? What about in that 30 minutes? Would there have been an appreciation that with ACM cladding materials, they may render cavity barriers ineffective even before that time because they're not a solid surface and they may warp and deflect under heating?
Are you asking, I'm sorry, are you asking could that happen from a technical point of view?
No, I'm asking whether you think that those dangers would have been understood at the time by cladding contractors.
Yes, I think it's something that they would have thought about.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have thought necessarily that therefore we can't do this on that account alone.
Right, I understand. Can I just show you one email at this point, which is specific to the Grenfell project? If we can go to HAR 406585. So I want to focus on the top email. So for context, this is an email from Daniel Anquetil-Jones, who was the design manager at Harley Facades. It's dated the 27th of March 2015. And this arose in the context of a discussion about the appropriate resistance for the cavity barriers in the facade at Grenfell Tower. Mm-hmm. There was a debate going on as to what rating the cavity barriers needed to have, whether 30 minutes or a greater fire resistance. And we can see that Mr. Anquetil-Jones gives a view about on this point about fire barriers and their rating, and he says there just that it's ridiculous. There's no point in fire stopping as we all know, the ACM will be gone rather quickly in a fire. The whole point is to stop unseen fire spreading in the cavity and moving to other parts of the building. And then he goes on, and we don't need to look at those parts. So he's saying there that there's no point in fire stopping. As we all know, the ACM will be gone rather quickly in a fire. The whole point is to stop unseen fire spreading in the cavity and moving to other parts of the building. Now, in his oral evidence, when he was asked about this email, Mr. Anketell-Jones said that he was referring to the fact that aluminium will melt quickly in a fire, and that that's a fact known throughout the industry, that in a fire, an aluminium facade will not last very long. It will melt and fall off the building. Now, would you agree with that it was well known in the industry that a fire in an aluminium facade that the aluminium facade will not last very long. It will melt and fall off the building.
If we're talking about an ACM
Yes.
here, yes. Yes, I would say that was pretty well known, yes.
And so those physical properties of aluminium would be well known throughout the cladding industry, yes?
Yes.
Do you consider
So just to be clear, we're not talking here about a normal aluminium panel on its own. We're talking about aluminium as part of a composite.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor ought also to have known at this time that ACM would be gone rather quickly in a fire because it contained a combustible PE core?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, finally, on the topic of the UAE fires, can I just show you another email? This is at CEP 49719. You just blow it up a little bit more on the screen. This is an email from Deborah French of Alcoa, or better known as Arconic, to a number of individuals within CEP who were the fabricator of the panels at Grenfell Tower. And the subject is BBC report, ref ACM in the UAE. So this is consistent with you saying that the UAE fires were well reported, for example, by the BBC, yes? And just reading her email, she says, "Hi, as you may be aware, there have been some reports via BBC concerning a fire on a building in UAE regarding ACM. As a business, we are aware of this report and our technical team are following the details. But in the meantime, I wanted to add some thoughts that may help if you get questions from your customers, clients, etc. Regarding the supply of Rainabond in the UK, as you know, we supply both PE, polyethylene, and FR, fire-resisting core, and can control and understand what core is being used in all projects due to the controlled supply route we have. By only supplying Rainabond to a very small group of approved fabricators and working very closely with them on all projects, we are able to follow what type of project is being designed, developed, and then offer the right Rainabond specification, including the core. At this stage, we will continue to offer both PE and FR core and continue the close working relationship we have with our approved fabricators to make sure the right technical support, Rainabond specification and materials are being used and installed on Rainabond projects. And then many thanks for making me aware of the reports and for your continued support." Now, would it be fair to say that this email reflects what you have termed to be a growing awareness in the industry regarding the fire risks posed by ACM cladding with a PE core? Yes,
and I think it also goes beyond that growing awareness. It's a sort of, it's written in as a response to a potential problem I believe this manufacturer must have seen and trying to reassure their clients.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, this email was sent to a fabricator. What would you have expected a fabricator to do upon receipt of information like this at the time about the fire risks posed by ACM PE?
It's a rather confusingly worded email, I think, but I think what the fabricator would have got from it, I think, would be to question perhaps should we be using a PE or an FR core, perhaps, knowing that those alternatives, the FR alternative was available. I think they should have someone should have said, well, perhaps an FR call would be more appropriate for our project or something.
Yeah. Would you have expected that sort of email to be sent to cladding contractors to whom ACM PE was being supplied, either currently or thereafter?
Yes.
If the reasonably competent cladding contractor had become aware of an email like this, would you have expected that to provoke any action within that cladding contractor if they were either currently using or proposing to use ACMPE?
Yes.
And what would you have expected them to have done?
I think they would have gone back to the manufacturer or their supplier and just examine the issues involved a little bit more, and to say, are you sure we're okay using this kind of PE system when an FR system might be a better bet?
Yeah. You tell us on this theme, if we go to page 37 of your report, paragraph 9.5, you say there, as a general observation, I would expect the manufacturers of relevant materials, cladding and insulation, to have been aware of these fires and their implications to a greater degree than cladding contractors. I would expect such manufacturers to draw to the attention of their customers the relevant risks.
Yeah.
And just to be clear again, do you draw any distinction there based on the fires that you've seen and what was in the technical press about what you would have expected of a cladding manufacturer as compared to an insulation manufacturer in terms of what should have been done about a notice taken of these fires? Well,
it's interesting. I think both the insulation manufacturer and the cladding manufacturer should have been aware, because some of these fires were the result of insulation burning and some due to the cladding burning, and some were the result of both.
Yes.
But that said, I think the perception in the industry that I recall at that time was that it was the cladding, the ACM cladding, that was perceived to be the bigger problem.
Yes. And as you say at paragraph 9.4, you've said that the UAE fires were reported at the time as being specifically exacerbated by the ACM cladding, yes?
Yes.
And would you expect manufacturers of ACM cladding to do anything further than simply draw their customers' attention to the relevant risks? Would you have expected them to have gone any further than just drawing attention to the risks, or to take more serious steps?
I would expect them to have taken more serious steps and said, look, we are concerned about the use of PE cord materials for tall buildings, and we would recommend that you start using the FR cord materials, for example.
Yeah.
But I'm conscious of some of the evidence in the inquiry, and that gives me stronger benefit of hindsight,
yes,
if you like. But at the time, yes, I think it would be reasonable that the manufacturers would have taken a more proactive approach to ensuring that their products were being used safely.
Yes, I understand. To your knowledge, did any authoritative body concerned with cladding or the construction industry, for example, the Cwct, the NHBC, the BCA, publish any cautionary guidance or recommendations specifically following these fires?
I think the TGN note 18,
yeah,
coming from the BCA, looking at the dates of 2014 and 2015, seemed to correspond to the growing awareness due to these fires. And it may be that was one of the reasons why they felt that the whole question needed clarification,
yes,
apart from the other questions we discussed earlier. So that may have been related to it, but I can't recall anything specific following these fires.
Yeah.
We're specifically addressing these fires and thinking, what should we do about them, about this problem? And I think if I could give a view here, is I think one of the problems was that as far as I understand it, there was not great loss of life in these fires. And they were serious fires, very serious fires, but there wasn't great loss of life. And perhaps, therefore, people didn't take them seriously enough. It was a failure of imagination.
Right, yes. Yes, my next question was, do you consider that the lessons of these fires were properly learned by the UK construction and cladding industry before the Grenfell Tower fire?
No.
And the reason for that, you think, may emanate from the fact that there just wasn't a significant loss of life, so it didn't jump to people's attention? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And as I'm saying, there's a bit of this attitude of, well, it hasn't happened, so it can't happen.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Given that at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, there were a large number of other high-rise residential buildings across the UK that were clad in PE called ACM, do you think that tells us anything about whether the dangers associated with the use of such products were well understood in the cladding industry?
I don't think they were sufficiently well understood, no.
What comfort, if any, would the reasonably competent cladding contractor take from the fact that some of the products used on the Grenfell Tower facade had been in use for many years?
I'm not sure what the way you phrased that question. I'm not sure how to answer it.
Yes, I mean, I guess what I was saying is if you try and put yourself in the mindset of the reasonably competent cladding contractor, let's take the ACM PE in 2014, deciding whether to use it, what comfort would you expect them to take from the fact that ACM PE had been used for many years on similar buildings? What weight would you give to that?
I think quite a lot of weight, in the sense that the construction industry, or some parts of the construction industry, has a sort of, sometimes I think, a rather head in the sand view, which is that if it's been all right for 20 years, it'll be all right tomorrow. You know, and as I said, it's a failure of imagination sometimes.
Yes.
So I think they probably did take comfort from the fact that there hadn't been a major disaster. So there was a sort of complacency.
Yes, but sitting here now, do you consider it was reasonable for them to have taken that comfort at the time?
No.
And what about any comfort taken from the fact that products, let's take the ACM PE, had been used on many buildings, so not just for many years, but there were many other buildings with it on.
Yeah.
Again, was that reasonable to take comfort from that?
No, I don't think it was reasonable.
Yeah.
No.
On a similar theme, what comfort would the reasonably competent cladding contractor take from the fact that the products were manufactured by well-known and ostensibly reputable companies?
Well, yes, they would have taken comfort from that.
Yeah, and reasonably so, in your view?
I can't. I find that hard to answer.
Yes, okay. In your view, do these considerations in any way lessen the need for the reasonably competent cladding contractor to conduct rigorous and exhaustive compliance checks each time they use the products? Is that what you would expect of the reasonably competent cladding contractor?
Yes.
Now, you've also helpfully referred us, if we go to page 32 of your report, at paragraph 7.6.21, to the fact that there was the first international seminar for fire safety of facades held in Paris in November 2013. You've got that right at the top there, referring to that seminar. And you say that this was significant, that this conference was held that year, as it reflects a growing awareness of the fire safety of facades at that time, possibly as a result of the fires in France in 2010 and 2012 and the spate of fires in the UAE in 2012. Now, given that Harley's involvement in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment began in 2013, would it be fair to say that that occurred on the cusp of that increase in awareness of the fire safety of facades within the industry?
Yes, although I wouldn't have expected Harley to be specifically aware of this seminar.
No, I understand that. Given your view that the level of technical expertise of UK-based cladding contractors might have been slightly less than that of their international counterparts, would it be fair to say that the increase in the awareness of the fire safety of facades that you refer to was more widespread amongst top-tier international contractors than amongst UK-based contractors, certainly in those early years, 2012, 2013?
Probably true, yes.
Right, yes. Yeah. And does it follow that it might have taken a little bit longer for that awareness to have filtered down to the UK cladding contractors that you've referred to?
Yes, except I don't think they were unaware. I'm not saying that the UK cladding industry was unaware. I think they were. They probably were aware of the issues.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Now, you've referred to one particular paper of relevance that appears to have been delivered at this conference. If we could go to page 32 of your report. Sorry, we're on 32, 7.6.23. You say there, one paper of particular relevance was Fire Hazards of Exterior Wall Assemblies containing combustible components by White, and I'm not going to pronounce all the other authors of that paper, but White and others. Let's just turn to that paper. It's at IMA 50930. Now, this is, just to be clear, this is the final version of the paper from June 2014, whereas the conference was in November 13. And it's clear that there was a presentation by these authors with this title at that conference. I think what we can't be 100% clear about is whether this entire paper was presented then or whether this is the final version. But if we just look at page 3 of this paper, we can see that it was drawing attention in the last few lines of the foreword, in that first paragraph. If we look at the last 4 lines, it states there have been a number of documented fire incidents involving combustible exterior walls, but a better understanding was needed of the specific scenarios leading to these incidents to inform current test methods and potential mitigating strategies. And what this paper does is it examines those documented fire incidents and what they were aware of from those, and then goes on and does an analysis of current test methods in the latter part of the paper, yes? If we go within this paper to where we've got this spate of recent fires in the UAE and look at page 46. Here we can see we've got reference to the Al-Taya Tower in Sharjah 2012, and we can see, reading 2 lines down in the text, the exterior of the building was clad with metal composite panels consisting of aluminium with a polyethylene core, yes?
Yes.
So we can see it's not just, you don't just learn that it's ACM, but also it's ACM-PE.
Yes.
And then the same is true if you go over to page 47. This is dealing with a different fire in Dubai in 2012. And again, if you look second line down, the building was clad with metal composite panels consisting of aluminium with a polyethylene core. And then the same at 48, page 48. Again, looking at this same spate of fires, you can see the Tamwheel Tower, Dubai 2012. And it says, picking it up at the end of the first line, the building was clad with metal composite panels consisting of aluminium with a polyethylene core. So this paper in late 2013, 2014 was clearly drawing attention to the use of ACM with polyethylene cores. That's right, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in terms of who attended this November 2013 Paris conference at which this paper was presented, if we go back to your report, you tell us at page 33, paragraph 7.6.2.8, you say there that you've not been able to obtain the specific attendance list for these seminars, but the Research Institute of Sweden has provided a contact list in connection with these seminars. And the attendees were apparently drawn from this list. And it says the list contains a wide range of international organisations, including quasi-government bodies, universities and test houses, manufacturers and consultants. There do not appear to be any main contractors or cladding contractors on the contact list, which indicates to me that contractors generally would have relied on manufacturers to be involved in such seminars and to have fed back information as necessary. So you've told us that about the attendance at these this cladding conference. And I think we do see individuals from Kingspan, do we not, on that attendance list?
Yes, if you say so.
Yeah, you can take it from me that there's individuals from Kingspan who attended.
Yes.
It's consistent with what you've said there about it comprising of mainly, or people including manufacturers and consultants. And then you tell us, if we go to page 34, the next page, at 8.1.1, you say the combustibility of these panels was, in my opinion, well known in the industry, particularly since the UAE fires in 2012 to 2016.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, is it your evidence that regardless of the fact that main contractors and cladding contractors did not attend this particular conference, the information disseminated at this conference and similar industry events would have meant that there was a filtering down in the industry of an awareness of these risks from using ACM cladding?
Absolutely, yes. And I think the important point is that these conferences took place at all. I mean, these are not just fire conferences or for cladding conferences. These are specific conferences about fire risk in cladding.
Yes.
So what it said, whether or not people attended, the fact that people thought it was a big enough problem to have a major international conference in 2013 and again in 2016.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Now, taking into account your evidence that the combustibility of ACM panels was well known in the industry, do you agree that the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have been aware not only of the occurrence of the UAE cladding fires in 2012-2013, but also the causes of those fires?
Yes.
Yes, so including the fact that they involved ACM PE.
Yes. To be clear, cause... the ACM panel didn't cause the fire, it propagated it.
I see.
If that makes sense, yeah.
Would they have been aware that the ACM PE propagated the fire?
Yes.
Yes. Would the reason... Yes, and so just to be clear, the reasonably competent cladding contractor would have been aware that ACM panels with a polyethylene as opposed to an FR core had been involved in a number of these fire incidents on high-rise buildings?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, that's a good moment, and it's the lunch break in any event.
I think it's time we had a break then.
Yes, I'm going to move to a different topic now.
All right, well, Mr. Sakula, it's time we all had a break for some lunch. So we'll do that now. We'll come back at 2 o'clock, please.
Right.
And again, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone outside the room.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, 2 o'clock then, please. Thank you.